I guess from the first time we learn language, we learn it differently. We learn how to use it differently for different audiences. We learn how to say one thing to one person and another to another. One kind of language as a child you learn for your parents, another for brothers and sisters. Later you learned another for classmates. And now today we learn different ways to do audience analysis within our setting for funding, within our setting for proposals. I want to begin with a discussion then of a basic system of writers and texts and readers. To begin, let's think about the basic model. There's an encoder, that's you, your colleagues, as you write down the elements of the proposal. Those are your thoughts. There's a signal, and that's the written word itself. Connotation, denotation, all the elements that make up the cohesive unity of the world of the document involved in that signal. And then on the other end, there's the decoder. But as well, that decoder, the reader, has a great complex issue. And that is that the audience is multiple and the audience is not singular. So it's very important early on in the proposal writing process to think about a distinction made by rhetorician Linda Flower and others between writer-based documents and reader-based documents. A writer-based document is a draft. It's something that's intended for you, perhaps for you alone, perhaps for a close colleague. But a reader-based document, that piece which goes out to the funder, that goes to the agency, is something entirely difficult. And there is a transformation. The more we know about our own ideas, the more we know about a funder, that helps us go from reader-based documents, from writer-based documents rather, to reader-based documents. Let's talk about some models, if we can, of audience analysis. Very important is the idea of the stakeholder model. This is where we understand that our audience have certain shared beliefs, knowledge, attitudes about those things that they hold important. For example, the Andrew W. Sloan Foundation is very interested in asynchronous or distance learning. We might therefore work that situation up and try to understand as much as we can about those things that the Sloan Foundation holds to be important. For example, who's previously gotten funding money from the Sloan Foundation and the idea of distance learning. The more we know about the Sloan Foundation, the more we know about the ideas that they hold valuable. This is a stakeholder model. First, we look at the knowledge of those people who are reading our proposals. What do they know? What can we assume that they know? What don't they know? We look at their beliefs. What things do they hold true? What things are they going to try to understand more about? What things, more importantly, will they just simply discard? And of course, the idea of attitude. Persuasion is very important in that it helps highlight the idea of attitude. Fishbein and Asian, in a theory called reason action, help us advance the idea of attitude, the tendency that someone has towards understanding, towards believing that something will or will not be adopted. Attitude then also becomes an important part of stakeholder analysis. Another model we might look at, as well as stakeholder analysis, is the translation model. I want you to literally think of a translation here, of taking a foreign language, for example, and rendering it into English. How would we make translation work? Well, very often that's an analogous situation to providing technical information for non-specialists. We would, for example, provide historical background of how an idea emerged. We might provide analogies of how one thing works in terms of another, an analogy that would be simple perhaps, or an idea that might be more easily understood. Would certainly provide visual representation and would explain what we were showing in the visual representation, and would very often provide an illustration of the significance of those things that we're finding. Why is this important? Well, again, don't assume that everyone who reads the proposal has the same technical information or knowledge or background as you do. Very often, it's useful to provide a translation, especially in very deep and complex technical material in a proposal. Another model is the organizational model. And here we try to understand the organization as if it sort of has personality. An organization, for example, will not consist, as our personalities do, of any one point of contact. There are different parts of the organization. And in this case, We're looking at different readers. There's certainly a primary audience, perhaps, of decision makers, but there are also going to be secondary audiences of implementers inside of organization, and then by immediate audiences, those that will exert rather quality control, and I've said here administrative gateways, but of course those who are also set up barriers within the organization as well. We also have to understand characteristics of individuals within organizations as well. Again, asking questions about their skill and knowledge level. Again, these are the people who will read the proposal. What is their educational background? What is their work experience? What are their beliefs, their goals, their values, their attitude toward the proposal you're making? And most important, what will motivate them to accept your proposal? Personal idiosyncrasies are always there, and as much as you can, you should account for these with readers. Will people be detail-oriented? Will they be methodological in their approaches to reading your document? Will folks be results-oriented? Will they be very decisive in what it is they're trying to find out? As much as possible, try to understand the organization, the funding source, and the personality of that funding source, as well as try to get some ideas of the readers who will review your proposal. There are some false assumptions about audiences. What follows basically advice given from years and years of proposal writing. It's false to assume that the person addressed in the proposal is the real audience. In fact, it may not be at all. Very often proposals have multiple readers. Some are highly technical people, some are people involved in business and finance, and very often lay people read it as well. It's also false to assume that readers of the proposal are a group of specialists in the field as well. Very incorrect to assume that everyone's going to have either the same knowledge of the situation you're proposing as you do. It's false to assume that readers of a proposal are as familiar with the context of the proposal as you are, or that, for example, they have daily discussions about the content of the proposal. Very often, a reader's mind would have to be refreshed of the significance of a proposal, even if it's to a specific funding source at a particular time. So background information, sometimes narrative, can become crucial there. It's false to assume that a reader of a proposal has the same passion that you do in reading the proposal. And while passion should certainly carry the day, again, sometimes the best ideas will fall on, if not deaf ears, certainly ears that are consumed with other kinds of noise. It's important to think about that metaphor because there's an enormous amount of noise, in metaphoric noise, in corporations and funding sources, in government, non-government, and you have to find ways to get the single precise message, your signal across, in spite of all the noise that exists. What's true about audiences? Well, they're certainly complex. There's certainly the idea of one reader or discourse being private is very often shown to be not true in practice. The role of the writer has to be very precise, very meticulous in getting ideas through. The role of the reader, sometimes you can know it, sometimes you can't. So what you've got to do is anticipate contingencies that will arise in audiences, as many contingencies as you can, and plan for those so that your message can persevere through. And of course, the most important thing about proposal writing in the planning stage is you need to have systematic and precise research about the nature, the design, the mission of the funding agency. Spending time in the early part of the proposal process will yield enormous benefits when it comes time to submit the proposal.